All right, everybody, welcome in and welcome back to another episode of Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Welcoming in all Notre Dame fans, Notre Dame haters, college football fans in general. This is your host, Ben Belden. And like I said, we're back to talk about Notre Dame, some fall camp happenings, some name, image, and likeness stuff that kind of goes along with some Notre Dame recruiting. And then obviously we're going to, talk counting down to Ohio State, which is coming up here in just under 2 weeks as well. Probably won't delve too far into the Ohio State talk as, there's plenty of time to talk about specifics about what we think will go on in Columbus here in a couple weeks. So we'll save most of that talk, but obviously, like I say, that game is now just under 2 weeks away. We're excited about that. If you're new here, I introduced myself already, but I'm Ben Belden, your host. I really encourage you to come on over and follow on Twitter. Hit me with that follow button over there. Oftentimes I bring those conversations from Twitter and bring it to this show. And sometimes I bring this show and I take those conversations on over to Twitter as well. So hit that follow button. Make sure you're tuned into the conversation. I'd greatly appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you're liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing to the YouTube channel. Hit those notifications so that you know when we go live. Whether you're coming to us from the Voice of College Football channel or whether you're coming to us from the Notre Dame channel specifically. And if you feel so inclined, support by making a donation to Mark Rogers TV. You can get that to us via Venmo or PayPal, and you can get that information in the description. Finally, then, at any point in tonight's show, if you have a comment, you may have your voice heard. Make sure you leave that comment. There'll be different times where I've got a script of what I'm talking about, but there'll be plenty of times where I stop and check those comments. And if they go along with what I'm saying, I might include those comments and talk about them here on tonight's show. So feel free to tune in and interact that way, if you will. So, all right, to football then. A little less than 2 weeks now, 13 days, I guess, to be specific. Easy for me to say. Notre Dame heads to Columbus, first weekend of September. A game that, certainly Notre Dame fans, Ohio State fans, college football fans should be really looking forward to. Next week, we have week 0 of college football. So we'll have actually college football to talk about, which is nice for people like me who like to talk about college football. Instead of just simply speculating and talking about recruiting and all of those things, we'll have actual games to discuss and digest. So in tonight's program, mostly just going to talk about a couple things that I've heard that I like out of Notre Dame's fall camp, and then a couple things that I don't like heading towards the season, which is going to take us into kind of a couple of conversations, bigger picture things that we're going to talk about kind of towards the end of the show as well. Okay, so a couple things that I like. I've made a list here of things that as I digest the things that I've read and heard on other podcasts from insiders, the subscription sites that I've read about Notre Dame's fall camp, a couple things that I've heard that I'm reacting to. Number one, and this was, I know that some of this is a little bit old news. I got to get on here a little bit more often to talk about Notre Dame football. That's for sure. However, all of these things, I guess, are major things that, regardless of when I read them, I think is going to be big for Notre Dame this particular season. The very first thing that, one of the first things when fall camp started that I just love, that it may seem as a somewhat minor detail to some, I think is Notre Dame's emphasis early on in fall camp on especially their red zone offense and defense. It seems like when you started reading the first, couple practice reports from, those who are lucky enough to be there, they talked about how through the first few practices, at least in what the media could see, there was a very high emphasis, a large percentage of the practice focused on red zone offense. In fact, when they were talking about, the quarterback, I'll call it a competition between Tyler Buckner and Drew Pine, what you read a lot early on was the difference in, how they are in the red zone, how they performed. And you saw reporters saying, well, we only saw them make throws, in the red zone, in a red zone setting. This to me was, like I say, to some might be somewhat insignificant of an observation. Certainly all teams work on the red zone. Certainly all teams want to be good in the red zone. However, to me, I think it really spoke to, where Marcus Freeman is as a head coach and what he's going to emphasize and where he feels like he can be efficient and effective with his particular offense, and what they're trying to do. And here's why. I think there's no secret that the Notre Dame offense hopefully is going to look a little bit different. After all, I know the offensive coordinator and Tommy Rees is remaining the same. And you may have your opinions, and I have my opinions with how much Tommy Rees was allowed to do within the offense, how creative he was allowed to be, how hamstrung he was by his predecessor at head coach in Brian Kelly. And, I think it's fair to say that this offense is going to look different, and is going to kind of emphasize the things that its starting quarterback, Tyler Buckner, does well. And you got to think that, approaching this season ahead of a game against Ohio State, you know that this new type of offense, I mean, there are going to be some hiccups. It would be irresponsible to think that Notre Dame is going to go out and just score at will against Ohio State. We'll just put it that way instead of putting a number on it. There's going to be times, with a new offense, there's going to be times where it looks real good. And there's going to be times when the defense adjusts. It might sputter for a little bit, and it might be a little bit up and down, especially early on, which is a problem given that the fact that your first game is against a top 5 opponent. I believe Ohio State is ranked second, unless I'm completely tripping, which is always a possibility. But a top 2 opponent in Ohio State the first week of the season. So I would expect, at certain times, Notre Dame's offense going to look good. We saw that last year. The scripted part of the offense looked really good. It was, throughout the game at times where the defense adjusted and we got off script and that type of stuff where it wasn't so good. But, when you take things into context, you're bringing back a quarterback who was the backup last year, didn't get a lot of down the field throwing opportunities for whatever reason in many games. A very young wide receiver core, running backs in Chris Tyree, Logan Diggs, that aren't, really, really seasoned, I guess you could say. They have some experience, but just aren't tried and true veterans just yet. And so you would expect the offense to have a little bit of difficulty. That said, if you make the most of the offense in the red zone, if you score touchdowns every time you get to the red zone, if Notre Dame only gets to the red zone 4 times and they score touchdowns every single time, that's 28 points. Whereas on the other side of the coin, if Notre Dame's offense is working on red zone offense, well, guess what the defense is doing? Working on the red zone defense as well. And so therefore, if Ohio State with their explosive offense, well, they could get to the red zone, they get there 7 times and they kick a field goal all 7 times, Notre Dame wins that football game. Now, those are extreme examples, but I think the point holds that, you can't expect Notre Dame's offense to just move the ball at will all over the place against a team like Ohio State. And you can't expect Notre Dame's defense to not allow some chunk plays to a very, very explosive offense in Ohio State, and not expect them to be able to move the ball. But if you limit them to threes in the red zone more often than not, that gives you a chance. To me, this emphasis on the red zone just kind of, I guess the best way I can put it makes it sound like Marcus Freeman is a real realist in this situation. And you know what? I think that I just think that there's a game plan already in place for Ohio State. I think that game plan has been basically in place since Marcus Freeman took the job, shortly after the bowl game against Oklahoma State. And I think that game plan is being executed even from the first days of camp, which I love to see. Another thing that I like to transition a little bit here is, the confidence I hear from guys like Braden Lindsay. I think there was some comments, reporters that get to go to Notre Dame practice got to talk to Chancey Stuckey, the wide receiver coach, and Braden Lindsay and some of the other receivers just the other day. And the things that came out of those comments were, Braden Lindsay most notably said that he is playing what he feels like is his best football of his life. A lot of that has to do with who Chancey Stuckey, who is replacing Del Alexander, who he is as a football coach, and his ability to get a guy like Braden Lindsay to buy in. There were comments that Chancey Stuckey made that, Braden Lindsay was watching some film of receivers at Baylor, and his name evades me, but Baylor had a receiver that was drafted last year, and Lindsay said, "Hey, coach, can that be me?" And Chancey absolutely said, "You know what? Yes, it can be you if you buy in." And I think this is particularly important for Notre Dame because Braden Lindsay just has to have such a huge role in this offense. He has to be effective in this offense because, as much as Notre Dame's going to rely heavily on Lorenzo Styles, who I think is going to be really good, Tobias Merriweather, who I think is going to be really good, Jaden Thompson, who I think is going to be really good, Michael Mayer in the passing game at tight end, who is already very, very good, and some other younger tight ends, and, Deion Colsey, if he's healthy, which we'll see about. Braden Lindsay's the fifth-year senior in that room. Joe Wilkins, if he's healthy, also a fifth-year senior in that room. But Lindsay's the one that, has all the speed, the high upside, the bona fide playmaking ability, the confidence, the leadership that you need, especially given the loss of Avery Davis, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But to me, Braden Lindsay is going to be the key. Maybe not the key, but he's going to be a major key for how Notre Dame plays. He's going to be a guy that really you can't take out a whole awful lot. He's going to be a guy that, Notre Dame needs take the top off the defense speed on the field, and he's the guy that does that. A lot of raised questions about whether Lindsay was going to move more inside given the injury to Avery Davis. I don't necessarily see that happening. I think Lindsay's your outside, take the top off the defense type of a guy that allows a tight end underneath to get open, or Matt Salerno, who is going to maybe fill in a little bit in that slot receiver position, or Chris Tyree that might move out there. You got to have that top end speed, and it's got to be effective, and you got to respect it. You have to make defenses respect it, I guess I should say. Braden Lindsay does that for Notre Dame's offense. So if he's effective, the offense is going to be really good. I also love to move on to the next one as I kind of get through my list here. The naming of Tyler Buckner as the quarterback early on. I think this was, really good timing by Marcus Freeman. I think it's been about a week now since we've heard that Tyler Buckner was indeed going to be the starting quarterback. And when I heard this news that Buckner was getting named, I think we all thought he was going to be the quarterback anyway. I think that if you listen to any expert who's there, who watches, who sees things, I think that everybody knew it was the worst kept secret that Tyler Buckner was going to be the quarterback. However, given that neither he nor Pine had really started, had significant time starting, significant time playing the quarterback position last year. And I'm talking about, leading multiple drives. I know Tyler Buckner had Virginia Tech. I know Drew Pine had Wisconsin. They both played at times for different reasons, and they got significant times in a game or two, but neither of them has the I guess, experience of starting multiple games, being the quarterback that the other team has scouted for, so on and so forth. Given all that, I think you had to make this at least a little bit of a competition because, you need to motivate those guys. And I think that's what happened. And I think the decisiveness of Freeman to make this decision was welcome relief from what Notre Dame fans have become accustomed to when it comes to their quarterback position. So many times, I think back specifically to the Malik Zaire, Deshaun Kaiser saga that I think really played a major part in Notre Dame going 4-8 in 2015. There was no decisiveness at the quarterback position. Everett Golson and Tommy Rees, to go back a little bit further, there was no decisiveness. To me, this shows the decisiveness from Marcus Freeman. If there's anything that I like about Marcus Freeman when you compare him back to Brian Kelly, it's that this guy doesn't mess around. This guy makes decisions. He sticks to his guns, whether that's, talking about the quarterback position, whether that's talking about recruiting, which again, we're going to talk about here in a second. And it shows that this team has a direction. And again, like I said, when I was talking a little bit earlier, it shows that there is a game plan in place for Ohio State, that we know what we're doing against Ohio State. We've got weeks to prepare. And I expect that because of all of these things, because of who Marcus Freeman is and his leadership style, his decisiveness, and his ability to let Tommy Rees go out and design an offense and know who he's designing an offense for and game planning for. That means that shows something to me that I really like about Marcus Freeman and this staff, this coaching staff at Notre Dame. Because finally, let's face it, Drew Pine and Tyler Buckner are not the same quarterback. So, the offense you're going to run with Tyler Buckner is just different than what you're going to run with Drew Pine. I mean, that's to be expected. You're going to run a lot more read option, a lot more, some people are calling it the triple or even the quad option with Tyler Buckner at the quarterback, where he can keep it, he can hand it off, he can throw it short, or he can go down the field with it. And so, it only is going to do good things for Notre Dame to know who the quarterback is, for the rest of the offense to know who they're blocking for, to know where the ball's coming from, to know what types of plays they're going to run, to start wrapping their head around doing it. Because if you're waiting till the week of the Ohio State game to know all that, it's too late. It's far too late. Staying on the offensive side of the ball, and we'll make this one real quick. Xavier Watts moved back to the wide receiver position. I don't have a ton to say about this particular one, but I will say this. I'm not sure that, given where Notre Dame has started recruiting the safety position, that Xavier Watts was really going to factor much into Notre Dame's defense at safety. I know he's a great athlete. I know that he's a guy that has played both positions at a high level in high school, has bounced back and forth during his time at Notre Dame. But to be honest, I think Notre Dame right now, when you look at, my concern level for Notre Dame, much more concerned with the offense, finding a rhythm, much more concerned with, having enough tools in the toolbox offensively than I am on defense, where I feel like we're seeing Notre Dame show that they're pretty deep, at least at most positions of need. So I just don't know that Xavier Watts was going to be a factor at the safety position. I don't know that he was going to factor on the field for Notre Dame at all this year. I don't know that his move to wide receiver is going to factor in the game against Ohio State, but it could prove to provide some long-term help at the position, I think. At the beginning, maybe, he's a guy that you're running the very easiest of offensive plays for, the jet sweeps, and those types of plays, the screen passes where he's just got to catch, run, make a guy miss. And those are going to be the things that you see out of Xavier Watts early. Hopefully that means he evolves then into a route runner, a guy that can make the catch over the middle in traffic and those types of things. However, I like the idea generally of getting Xavier Watts back on the offensive side of the football, especially given what you lost to Avery Davis. Checking in kind of on the comments here. I see we have a good amount of people listening. Again, if you're new here, this is Mark Rogers TV, voice of college football. I'm your host, Ben Belden. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see my Twitter handle there. Make sure you're going over there and joining in the conversation on Twitter as well. These conversations tend to spill over into both places. So if you'd be so inclined to go follow me on Twitter, I'd really appreciate it. Whether you're a Notre Dame lover like me, a Notre Dame hater, we welcome those too. But like I say, join in the conversation over there. I'm just kind of scrolling through the the comments here. Just trying to get kind of caught up here. We've had a few comments here. Here's one from my good friend Nathan Urbach. Says Tobias Merriweather is the best freshman wide receiver season at ND since Kevin Stefferson. I'd have to look up Kevin Stefferson's stats. However, off the top of my head, I think, he was a guy that really showed some big playability. I think maybe had 600 or so yards his freshman year. That's a tall order, Nathan. But I agree. I think Tobias Merriweather is going to be a guy that is really, really important and really, really productive in Notre Dame's offense. I think Notre Dame's offense is kind of geared to a guy that can stride like Merriweather does, that has the wide catch radius like Merriweather has. And I also, don't sleep on Jaden Thompson either. I really, really like that kid as well, and what he can do. And I think he's a confident kid that Marcus Freeman really likes as well. I like this comment as well. I didn't really touch on this, but I'm going to say Chloe, maybe that is. Thank you for your comment. He says, if Logan Diggs is back in 100% in Columbus, he's a difference maker. I absolutely, yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I like Chris Tyree, and don't get me wrong, this isn't a knock on Tyree. I just don't know that, even though he's slated as the starter for Notre Dame, I just don't know that he is a bell cow, I guess, to put kind of an old school term on it. I just don't know that he's going to be the guy that carries the load often. I think Chris Tyree is going to be the guy. You get him out there, you're going to get him the ball in space a lot. He'll certainly run through the tackles a little bit. But with Tyree and Diggs, I like kind of the more thunder and lightning type of dynamic you sort of have going on there. Diggs is kind of an in-between between Tyree and Audric Estime, who I think is going to get, probably I hope 10 carries a game. So Logan Diggs, I sure hope he's healthy. We're kind of keeping an eye on that shoulder. Sounds like he's on track to maybe at least see how it goes against Ohio State. Here's a comment from a Notre Dame hater. Edward says, we all saw Freeman's defense blow a bunch of leads last year, and y'all think he will be this great head coach. Notre Dame lost one game last year, and they trailed the game the whole game. So not 100% sure where that comes from. I would say 11-1 is a pretty good track record for in a defense that, if you watched it from the beginning of the year, was only getting better as the year went on. So not really sure. Catching up on a couple others here, and then we're going to get into some things that I don't like that have gone on in camp. Like I say, just kind of, like I say, reading here. I like this comment. A dog named Brutus. Freeman could be a great coach. The trick is hiring the right people for your program. And I agree with that. I agree. One of the things that I really love about Marcus Freeman is that he's brought in guys that he trusts, that, share, are like-minded, I guess you could say, that share in his philosophies. And so Freeman's brought in guys that I really like. I really like Chancey Stuckey. I really like that he kept Tommy Rees. And you could go on down the list. As I sit here live on a show right now, I can't name their the whole coaching staff off the top of my head. But in general, I think this is a coaching staff that at the position, Dylan McCullough, I love as well at the running backs coach. Freeman has surrounded himself by good guys. Al Golden, another head coach. I think that's perfect for Freeman for defensive coordinator, because it's nice when Freeman's got that headset on to, be able to listen to another head coach in the headset. All right. I'm going to go ahead then. And obviously, this is, I don't know how I omitted this, but happy that Harry Hiestand is back. Absolutely. Anytime you can get the best, offensive line coach probably in the country, probably, maybe even when you put college football and NFL football together, Harry Hiestand might be one of the better offensive line coaches. We'll see. So we'll see. Okay. All right, so as promised then, I gave you kind of 5 things that I liked about Notre Dame, things that I've heard out of fall camp. And now I'm just going to kind of talk about a few things. I got 3 things listed here. One of them is then going to kind of take us into, a bigger discussion. And that's kind of probably where we'll wrap up. And we'll sort of see where we're at with the comments and things after that. But in talking about things that, I don't love coming out of fall camp, the most obvious, certainly is the injuries on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, I think that this one's a no-brainer. I think that, the loss of Avery Davis, as I talk about this, first of all, I think it's important, first to note, football aside, Notre Dame fandom aside, for most of us that are sitting here talking and listening right now, this hurts a lot for the person who is Avery Davis. Avery Davis, the guy, not necessarily just Avery Davis, the football player. And, for a kid, a guy that came to Notre Dame as a quarterback, moved to receiver, moved to defensive back, moved back to receiver, a guy that is going to bring not just football production, but leadership, speed, and just an overall day in and day out doing the things the right way, team before me type of a guy. The loss of Avery Davis can't be emphasized enough. As I thought about this, I've been asked and it's been discussed how Notre Dame replaces Avery Davis. And, the answer to that is, in a lot of ways, it's easy to replace Avery Davis. You got other guys, you got other talented guys on the football field. You got Chris Tyree who can move out into the slot, and you play maybe 2 running backs, or you have a 2 running back set with a tight end and 2 wide receivers. Or, Matt Salerno is, if he plays within himself, can get a few snaps here and there. Xavier Watts certainly is going to be kind of in the mix, probably in that slot position. I'm not saying you never move Braden Lindsay to the slot, although I don't know that, as I mentioned earlier, that's what he's best at. So maybe, there are ways you can play 2 tight ends. Michael Mayer is not going to leave the field on offense. So you don't really have to worry about that. You bring in a second tight end, Eli Raritan or Holden stays, and Mayer either moves out to the slot, or one of those guys is in the slot. There's ways to replace Avery Davis, the football player. What you don't replace, what you simply cannot replace, are the things that I mentioned: the toughness, the team before me, the guy that you look across at in the huddle, and he's been through it before, and you trust, and he's all right, and so therefore you're all right. You just can't replace that with Avery Davis. And so, Notre Dame on the football field, yeah, they're going to be okay. They're going to be okay replacing Avery Davis, the football field. You just don't replace that. You don't replace a captain like that. And so the best they can do is, next man up. I'm sure Avery's going to be a very vocal part of what goes on at Notre Dame in the wide receiver room and on Saturdays. If we know anything about him, he's going to be right there. He's going to be coaching those guys up. So I guess the bright spot of this is, Notre Dame just gained another really good wide receiver coach. And so I don't know. Like I say, just an absolutely gut-wrenching loss to lose Avery Davis like that. I've heard, I think that Davis, theoretically could have come back another year. Seems pretty well, like if you read between the lines of what he posted on Twitter in his kind of goodbye letter, that's not going to happen. I've seen some speculate that Avery Davis is now probably no longer going to be at Notre Dame at all. I don't know the answers to those questions. If anybody has insight into that, you can kind of let me know. But regardless, big loss of Avery Davis. Let's put it that way. And then there's Jarrett Patterson, which is a whole nother thing altogether. I don't know what to say about Jarrett Patterson. If you guys missed it, Jarrett Patterson, who started at center for Notre Dame for the last, I believe, 3 seasons now, moved to left guard before this year because, the coaching staff and he feels like it's best for his NFL longevity to play the guard position. moved to guard. And, last week people noticed, well, where's Jared Patterson? Wasn't out there. We found out that, has a little bit of a foot injury, going to be out a week to 10 days or so, according to Marcus Freeman, and is at least questionable for the Ohio State game, although I believe Freeman noted that he expects Jared Patterson to play. The only thing I'll say about this, I guess this is better now that he's moved to left guard, because with the turning over of the offensive line last year, you saw guys like Andrew Christofich, who would be probably his replacement at left guard, get a lot of reps at that position. You got Josh Lugg on the other side. You've got two really good tackles. Zeke Correll was maybe the best lineman consistently for Notre Dame last year at the center position, held down that position pretty well, got a lot of starts and a lot of good experience. And so, if there was a spot where it would be okay to lose Jared Patterson, I'm glad he moved to left guard. I mean, maybe I'm the only one that thinks that way, but it just, Jared Patterson brings a lot of the same things, to that offensive line group that we were talked about with Avery Davis, the experience, been there before, the guy that you look at in the huddle and, you see he's okay, he's being resilient. And so therefore you gather that strength from him. That's going to be hard to replace. And I sure hope he plays against Ohio State and that he's healthy against Ohio State. One would think that in order to beat Ohio State, you might want your best offensive lineman healthy. I mean, that would be a good start. Another thing I don't like is, and this really isn't a fall camp thing, but my goodness, the thinness at wide receiver. I tweeted very strongly about this last week. Again, if you're new here, you can find me on Twitter, engage with me. Not just Notre Dame fans. Feel free to come troll Notre Dame on my Twitter as well. But the thinness at wide receiver, just criminal. Notre Dame is a program that has boasted competing against the best, graduating champions. The goal has always been to compete for championships. And leaving the wide receiver position this thin is just not something that a championship team does, at least in my estimation. I mean, feel free to disagree with that, but what is it? They're down to 5 scholarship receivers that are healthy, I think, and 7 total. Maybe it is. I could have those numbers off. The bottom line is this, okay? I've talked a lot about how the difference between a team like, Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State that competes every single year for the most part, and Notre Dame, who's there once in a while, gets there, doesn't really always look like they belong. And I don't mean to start that argument of negativity necessarily, but, a team like those guys, the upper echelon versus Notre Dame is depth. I mean, you saw it when Notre Dame played Clemson back in the Cotton Bowl. Julian Love went down, and all of a sudden Notre Dame doesn't have a cornerback that can defend a Clemson receiver. Clemson tacks on 2 cheap touchdowns in the last couple minutes of the second quarter, and the game was over after that. Whereas if you have Julian Love out there, maybe they get 1, maybe they kick a field goal, and that game's completely different going into halftime. Not talking about Notre Dame and their past struggles, or not trying to make any of those types of arguments necessarily. The argument here is you've got to build depth. You've got to have guys that you can plug in, and the drop-off, maybe I'm not saying there's never any drop-off. I'm saying you've got to have guys that you plug in, and maybe you scheme your defense a little bit differently because they're in, but the drop-off isn't as significant as it is. And, maybe Lorenzo Styles and Tobias Merriweather and Jaden Thomas and those guys that are going to play are good enough that you're not going to be talking about this. But for right now, it's just tough for me to see, how Notre Dame goes out, competes, and wins games at Ohio State, for instance, without some depth at obviously the wide receiver position, other positions as well. But we're talking about how the wide receiver position is just so criminally thin. I don't get it. And there's shared blame here. A lot of it falls on the last regime. Some of it falls on the current regime because there's certainly some people left over from the last regime. Some of it was, Notre Dame, was thinking, we got Avery Davis coming back. We got enough guys. We got good tight ends. We won't take someone in the transfer portal, or didn't take someone in the transfer portal, or didn't cast a wide enough net to get someone in the transfer portal. But this wide receiver position thing, man, it tops the list of anxieties for me as a Notre Dame fan. Because, let's face it, wide receiver is a position you're going to lose somebody at some point. For some stretch of a game, you're going to lose guys to injury because that's the nature of football. You're going to lose a guy that twists a knee, twists an ankle, isn't 100%. And now you've really hamstrung yourself if you don't have a passing game that is going to be respectable because you're playing young, inexperienced guys. I'll stop there. And finally then, and this is kind of the last thing, and maybe I'll make this kind of the last thing that I sort of talk about here. Like I say, I had sort of in the plans to talk Notre Dame, Ohio State a little bit, but we've got about 2 weeks to do that before Notre Dame kicks off here. Yeah, the last thing that I'll talk about, I am reading some of the comments here. To touch on a couple of those, all Del Alexander and Brian Kelly's fault, pretty much. I would tend to agree. Tommy Rees was indeed, however, the offensive coordinator. Now, Tommy Rees is far less seasoned at this than those guys are, and you would expect Brian Kelly to, being the CEO that he was as the head coach, to step in and, if something wasn't going well, to make it go well. Brian Polian, recruiting coordinator, been at this a long time. How he leaves the wide receiver room that thin, not sure. There we go. Again, like I say, sorry. Reading some of the comments, catching up on some of the comments here. So anyway, okay. Finally, after that little brief little brain fart by me right there, I apologize for that. The last thing that I don't like about what's been going on with the Notre Dame football program is something that I've kind of been talking about on Twitter a little bit, something that I've conversed with some of my friends about. Notre Dame's struggles with recruiting. Now, I know Notre Dame has the number 3 class, so don't jump at me just yet. But their struggles with recruiting in regards to name, image, and likeness. Okay, and so if you missed it this past week, the crown jewel of Notre Dame's recruiting class, of the class of 2023, Keon Keeley, decommitted from Notre Dame, and there are a lot of reasons why that possibly happened that we'll sort of kind of allude to and touch on here. One of the guys that if you were going to go in and peg, okay, where are the guys that make this class a lot different from Notre Dame classes of seasons past? Keon Keeley is one of those guys that you would point to. Another guy that you would have pointed to would have been Dante Moore, who never was committed to Notre Dame, but some might argue that at some point he was probably a silent commit to Notre Dame, but hadn't announced for whatever reason, wanted to take official visits, wanted to, whatever reason there was. But suffice it to say that Dante Moore and Keon Keeley, 2 5-star type guys that Notre Dame was in the lead for, we'll say at the very least. And in the case of Keeley, obviously had a verbal commitment from him at some point, who are not going to be at Notre Dame next year, unless something wild happens with Keon Keeley or something like that, which never say never, I guess. But the question I have, I guess, and this is more of a rhetorical, I'll kind of go into answering my own question a little bit, but the question I have is, does Notre Dame have a real problem on their hands when it comes to recruiting because of name, image, and likeness? Okay, so let me frame where I'm coming from when asking this question. Obviously, Brian Kelly fed Notre Dame fans the line that Notre Dame shops down a different aisle when it comes to recruiting. It's tough to go out and recruit everybody that you want to, and then find out that that person isn't a fit for Notre Dame from an academic standpoint, from a culture standpoint, from whatever standpoint. You get what I'm saying. And so Brian Kelly, it seemed, and I think there's certain levels of truth to this, but seemed like he went ahead and from Marcus Freeman's comments, that's kind of where I'm gathering this, but Brian Kelly would look at a guy, see if he was a fit for Notre Dame, figure out how we can fit him into Notre Dame, maximize his potential, and make him a really good football player. Hence the terms graduating champions, hence the terms, you get what I'm saying. Attention to detail. Brian Kelly was trying to bring guys in, develop them, make them good football players, hopefully turn them into dudes, find a diamond into the rough for a large part of his recruiting class. Now, certainly I'm not making the argument that Kyle Hamilton wasn't a dude when he came to Notre Dame. I mean, the guy was playing as a freshman. So, there's some give and take to this argument that I'm making. But it seems to me, and others might disagree, and that's okay, that Brian Kelly would find guys that fit Notre Dame and then figure out if they were dudes later. Marcus Freeman at one point basically made the comment that we're going to recruit dudes and then we're going to see if they fit in at Notre Dame. Seems to me that Marcus Freeman has casted a wider net. There's a lot of difference between Brian Kelly and Marcus Freeman as personalities. And I think that the personality of Marcus Freeman is a real good fit for a place at Notre Dame because he upholds standards. He's a guy of a lot of integrity, a guy that, fits Notre Dame's culture in that way, but he also probably listens to your favorite rap music as well. He's a guy that, I think these kids can really relate to. And that's why he's done so well in recruiting. That's why he got commitments from guys like Keon Keeley that put Notre Dame at the number 1 ranked class at different points throughout this cycle. And so, I think there's no doubt that even though you could go back and you could say, well, Brian Kelly's best class was, ranked out just about where Notre Dame's current class is going to rank out. I don't think that you can make any argument that makes any sense at all, at least, that Notre Dame's recruitment hasn't taken a step forward. Okay. And so, yes, I know that I'm about to kind of complain about a class that's one of the best we've seen in the last 20 years, but it's hard as Notre Dame fans to think about how it could have been better given different circumstances. So, obviously the narrative on recruiting has changed. But, when you look at what happened with Keon Keeley and what happened with Dante Moore, one can only assume what happened was that basically NIL offers were better at other schools. And other schools were willing to throw around guaranteed money to get commitments out of these guys. Notre Dame wasn't necessarily willing to do that. I have my theories about how this all works. I think that basically what goes on is that, certain schools have partnerships with companies, alumni, whoever, and they're telling recruits, hey, you sign on the dotted line on National Signing Day. That's all you need to get your first NIL money. And it's guaranteed money. You're not going to play football forever. There's a chance you could come to college and get hurt. At least you've got that guaranteed money. And for a guy like Keon Keeley, a Dante Moore, could be possible that was very, very appealing to them. Notre Dame's package, Notre Dame, instead of offering that guaranteed money, and this is how I think NIL is supposed to work, to be honest with you. I think this is the spirit of name, image, and likeness. Notre Dame says, well, listen, you come to Notre Dame, you're going to have a Notre Dame education. You're going to, be exposed because you're going to play in nationally televised games every week. You're going to be on a really good football team. You're going to, if something happens to you, you got a Notre Dame education. And once you get here, you're going to have the opportunity to get some NIL money. But the difference is that guaranteed portion of it. And, to me, and we can talk about how to fix NIL all we want. To me, the big thing is that NIL should not be mentioned in recruiting. Certainly, you're never going to take NIL out of the picture altogether. However, because, recruits are going to be smart enough to understand that my exposure and my ability to gain NIL money is going to be greater at a place like Alabama, Ohio State, Notre Dame, those places, as opposed to a Houston or as opposed to a Vanderbilt or whatever the situation is. I got a comment on here that I want to kind of just address real quick. It's a new one. It says NIL isn't restricted to certain programs. Blaming NIL is blaming the program for not recruiting to the full extent. I mean, that's an interesting way to put it. And I don't 100% disagree. I really don't. However, Notre Dame is doing NIL differently than other schools are. And I think that Notre Dame has an approach where they're going to, like I say, they're going to bring them in. They're going to sell them on the Notre Dame experience. They're going to sell them on exposure, but they're not going to sit there and say, hey, we're going to throw hundreds of thousands of dollars at you just for signing your name on the dotted line. I just don't think that's where Notre Dame is at. And like I say, I don't think that was, and the reason they're not there is that that's not what NIL was supposed to be for. It's gotten out of hand. It's not regulated. If somebody steps in and says, hey, listen, let's regulate NIL so that at the most you can tell a recruit, well, here are some guys that came to this school, and here is a list of where they got NIL deals. You could be, if you do well here, you could potentially get a deal like this. Yeah, I absolutely agree that that's what should happen. Like I say, there's something that happened that caused guys like Dante Moore and Keon Keeley, who wanted to be at Notre Dame, to go elsewhere. And it's not that Marcus Freeman looked at him and said, hey, nope, we don't want you, because they wanted these guys. Okay. And so like I say, you can kind of make those arguments, and you can kind of speculate about all those things all you want. NIL has something to do with it. I see in the comments that NIL isn't going to be regulated. Why? As these big conferences come and they get together and they can do things, they can govern over these schools in a way that the NCAA has just let go over the years. I don't see why NIL can't be regulated. I don't know why you can't say, you can't offer guaranteed on the table money for a kid's commitment. I just don't think that's an unreasonable ask. Regardless, to kind of circle back and finish up and touch on the original argument, Notre Dame could sort of be in trouble here in the recruiting space, I think. Certainly, like I say, I laid out the Notre Dame argument. I laid out the fact that Notre Dame can sell a really good product in terms of, you're going to come here, you're going to get a Notre Dame education, which absolutely means something, especially given an alumni base as big as Notre Dame's. You can sell top quality football. You can sell, hey, you come here and, if to kind of quote the Manti Te'o documentary, you can go to Alabama and be the next really great player, or you can come here and be the only Manti Te'o, or the only Keon Keeley, or the only Dante Moore, or whatever. Okay. There's things that you can sell at Notre Dame that mean something. There really are. And if people make the argument otherwise, it's just not true. You've got a unique opportunity at Notre Dame to be the guy that elevates Notre Dame to the next level, to bring them from kind of the second tier of college football into that top tier, competing for a national championship, winning major bowl games, getting to the college football playoff, winning college football playoff games. Those things can be sold to some of these players, but I really, really worry that with NIL as currently constructed, that Notre Dame is going to miss out on the Dante Moores, the Keon Keeleys, which are going to be the guys that ultimately are going to make the biggest difference in doing that, in taking the next step of the program. And so, again, like I say, those are just my worries. Sorry. Long pauses mean I'm reading comments, guys. So I appreciate all of the comments. I'm going to get to a couple of them here real quick. Here's one from Will, who we mentioned earlier. Keon wasn't because of NIL. It was because of Saban's record of producing great defensive players. Has Notre Dame not created great defensive players? I mean, Nathan, if you're still around, perhaps you could list all of the defensive linemen that have been in the NFL recently. Stephon Tuitt just retired. You got Isaac Rochelle is on the Browns. I'm going to miss a ton. You get my point. The Okwaras, you go so on and so forth. Again, with the bright lights on, some of the names evade me, but Notre Dame's put more than their fair share of defensive linemen in the NFL. I don't know that I necessarily agree that was the only reason. Now, to compete for a national championship, yeah, sure. I mean, if that was what you said, then yeah, obviously go to Alabama. If that's you want a surefire, I'm going to be in and around the national championship every year, then sure. Catching up on a couple other ones here as we get there. Here's one. NIL may get some players to go to their school, but some recruits can actually sell their school brand first and foremost to get those top recruits. Some schools can sell their school and brand. You're right. And like I say, I think Notre Dame can sell pretty well. I think Marcus Freeman has shown that. Guaranteed money talks. I'll just kind of leave it there. Nathan says recruiting is going to be just fine, assuming the on-field product is good. And I generally agree with that too. I really do. You take a top 3, and maybe it ends up top 5, whatever it is. You take a top 10. You take a top 10 recruiting class and you put it together with good football. And now there's not a conversation between should I go to Alabama or Notre Dame for football reasons. At some point, maybe, Notre Dame, if Marcus Freeman continues recruiting at a high level, Notre Dame fans are patient with Marcus Freeman, who I've seen a couple of comments, people saying just that. If you're patient, then maybe this turns into, something really, really special at Notre Dame. I agree with that for sure. We got a comment. You signed a QB. Why wouldn't Moore go someplace else? CJ Carr is in the 2024 class. Dante would have been 2023. Top teams have multiple 5-star quarterbacks. Ohio State, Oregon, you get it. Catching up on a couple comments here. I don't know. I think pretty much everyone's just kind of having a conversation in the comments. I like this one. They, meaning schools, have to target their players, specifically quarterbacks who are well off and won't be as influenced by an NIL bag. I mean, sure. Okay. I mean, I guess I didn't read that whole comment before I put it up there, but you're right. Until NIL is regulated, it may be necessary to focus their energy on the 4 stars. I don't know that I agreed with that either, to be honest with you. That's an interesting thought. I think that, and here's the other thing, anybody that follows recruiting will tell you that the difference between, some of the highly rated 4 stars and the 5 stars, I mean, is there that big of a difference? No, not really. I'm not a guy that, puts a ton of emphasis on stars because, a lot of these, in Notre Dame's class, a Brendan Vernon is a good example, in my opinion, of a guy that's probably an underranked 4-star, but just doesn't have the same level of exposure, whether that's by choice or just by where he plays or whatever. I don't know. And so therefore I don't know that I necessarily, feel that, you have to go get 5 stars. I don't believe that. But, in a lot of instances, I mean, it's a no-brainer. This kid's really good. Keon Keeley is a no-brainer 5-star athlete. And so the more of those guys that you can get, the more you can, the better you're going to be. I mean, it's Jimmys and Joes and not X's and O's, as the old saying goes. I saw a comment about Manti Te'o in here that I'm not going to put on the screen, but obviously you haven't watched the documentary. He didn't make up an ex-girlfriend. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there. We've gone about 53 minutes here, getting up close to an hour, which is maybe even a little bit longer than I thought I would go on this particular night. This Sunday night thing hopefully is going to become kind of a tradition here. Like I say, Notre Dame is kicking off in about 2 weeks. More often than not, in about 9 of those games, I think that you will see me here on the post-game show covering what went on between the lines of Notre Dame football. And, more often than not, hopefully the idea then is come back Sunday after we've had time to digest, do a live stream like this. I have the capabilities at some point to make this a call-in show if we want to do that. And really have some fun with this. So make sure you like, comment, subscribe, share this stuff with your friends. We really appreciate that. That's how we grow this and continue to do the best, provide the best coverage. And if you're so inclined and you like what you heard today, go on. Like I say, the links and things are in the description for how you can support Mark Rogers TV. So the more you do that, the more we can bring on and do some fun things here. That would be great. So if you stuck with me this whole time, we've had some pretty good interactions here. I thank you for all the comments and whether they were good or bad, we appreciate it. I just like the interaction. If you would head over to Twitter, follow me on Twitter. Like I say, I'd love to continue the conversation with you over there. I'll talk to you again very, very soon. And until next time, go Irish.